Okay, folks, now's the time. So we've talked about what it is. We've talked about what it does. What I want to try and do in this session is show you how to actually go about using it. We're not going to go into a huge amount of detail. I'm not actually going to generate any software. I've got some pre-built stuff to demo to you. We will go through that process step by step, bit by bit, in minute detail on Friday during the post-conference workshop. So I'm just going to talk to you about what that process is and what that process looks like. And hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have a good idea of how you would be able to leverage Harmony Core in your own environment. Because really, in terms of the basic data-driven environment, the only thing that really changes is the repository that's being used, right? So drop your repository and your files into play, and the stuff that I'm going to describe to you now should be able to be achieved in your own environments. So first of all, what do you need in order to get up and running with Harmony Core? You do need Visual Studio 2017 15.8 or later. In fact, I would strongly recommend the latest version. And if you happen to be on 15.8.2, it was a disaster. So get upgraded as soon as you possibly can. I think the latest is 15.8.6 right now, although that might change any second. It usually changes every few days, as it seems. So you need Visual Studio 15.8 or later, not 15.8.2. You need the .NET Core SDK and runtime, which is, if you just Google with Bing Microsoft.NET and .NET SDK, and you will very quickly arrive upon the download link for that. I think I've got a slide full of links at the end of this as well. You need Synergy DE. You do need the very latest and greatest 10.3.3f release. I'd recommend that you have both SDE, x86, x64, and SDI installed. You do need CodeGen. In order to work in our sample environment, clearly you've got the Harmony Core libraries, you've got the EF provider, you can totally do your own thing. But if you want to work in our code-generated, data-driven environment as a starting point, then again, you will need the very latest CodeGen 5.3.6, which has been out there for a couple of weeks now. You will need internet access, at least initially, simply because the world is in NuGet.org, right? So when you create a new project, it's going to pull packages from NuGet. You don't need internet access on an ongoing basis in order to develop and so on, but you do need it to get those initial projects up and running and to pull any updates to packages that you might be using should you decide to do so. You will also probably need our project templates. We don't have Visual Studio templates at this point in time. In the .NET Core world, you tend to use the CLI tools to create projects. So our projects themselves are a NuGet package that you can download, and I'll show you how in a moment. And you need a repository describing your data and environment. In terms of the Harmony Core packages themselves, there are 4 packages that are part of the core environment. If you decide not to use our project templates and just go ahead and create a file new .NET Core application, these are the 4 you would have to reference. And there's various others depending on whether you decide to do CORS support for cross-domain stuff like Richard was talking about. We have various options in our code generation environment that turn on CORS support, turn on authentication and so on, turn on Swagger documentation, and depending on what options you choose, there may be other packages that you need. Our project templates have all of these references in place, so you can literally just create a new project and off you go. Once you've got that project up and running, the next step is to really getting the repository in place. We'll talk about that in a moment. And essentially, this whole sample environment that we're presenting here is all based around code generation. And these are all of the things that we code generate. There's a couple of additional ones, actually. But we generate data model classes that describe your data structures in an OO form. We generate metadata classes that provide extended information to the EF provider about your data. We generate entity data model, EDM classes. We generate DB context, which is an instance that exposes your data at runtime to the application. We create web API controller classes, or actually OData controller classes. We generate all of the startup code that configures the environment and turns on all the options you might select in our little environment. And potentially you have the option of generating a console app to self-host the applications of the services, and you can also generate optionally unit tests for all of the standard operations and endpoints that we code generated. All of these things, apart from the basics, basic data models and collections of data entities in controllers, most of these things are optional. You turn them on if you want them. Our environment basically leverages the Synergy EF provider that Jeff talked about earlier. So if we are exposing an endpoint that is customers, for example, then you will see code in the controller that just exposes dbcontext.customers. And that is the representation of all of your customers, or orders, or items, or inventory. And it's queryable. That's the thing that, all the stuff that Jeff talked about earlier. In other cases, in other endpoints, you'll see that we're using the EF provider in a more specific way. We might be calling those extension methods that Jeff talked about. So we might be doing a find by a certain key value or a find alternate based on an alternate key if you've turned on those levels of support in your environments. And we're also, when we're adding, updating, and removing, you'll see code that says things like customers.add, customers.update, customers.remove, and customers.save changes. So all of the controllers that we generate, you're not going to see the select classes or open statements or anything like that. We just use the EF provider. So typically, all of our controller actions have 1, 2, 3 lines of code in them, and we just hand off into the underlying EF provider to do all the work for us. Configuring your repository. So this is where you need to start doing some work. We already talked about this a little bit this morning, but really the key to success with this whole environment, if you want to get the best out of it, is to have your repository completely and comprehensively described. And that certainly includes tags if you have multi-record format files, accurate definitions of keys with all the segments and so on. CodeGen has some specific requirements when it comes to defining keys as well. It's really ideal if you define the keys in the repository in the correct sequence. So you define the primary key first, then the first alternate key and the second alternate key, or any foreign keys, follow all of the access keys, and so on, and describe the key segments accurately. If your repository is already well set up for ODBC or for report writer with all the relations and stuff in place, you should be in pretty good shape. Okay, you should be able to get up and running in this environment really quickly. When you are setting up the repository for Harmony Core, there are some specific things that you can do that are little extension points or customization points that we've added. The little strings in orange here are all little secret codes that you can embed in the field's long description in the repository. So the long description is just an 1800 byte buffer that we generally use when we're doing code generation to customize things. So if you put harmony_exclude in the long description, that field will just be invisible to the whole environment. If you say harmony as string, what that will do is take a decimal field that has a format string, perhaps a phone number, for example, and it will expose it as a formatted string. Okay? Right now, if you do that, we have got an outstanding issue that we have not yet implemented the deformatting of that back into a decimal on create or update. So just be aware of that. That's maybe something you don't want to do for real right now, but we'll get that fixed pretty soon. Harmony Authenticate, if you put that code in there, that will basically say that this field can only be accessed. You also have the option of saying Harmony Roles equals and naming roles in there, and that field will only be visible by authenticated users who also have one or more roles that are defined in there. You can also override the sample data that's generated in the API documentation if you wish. By default, it just uses ABC for alpha fields and 0 for numeric fields and things like that. But if you want to put meaningful sample data in there, then you can embed that information in the long description. Key definitions. It's one of the things you can do to really help this stuff work well is make sure that your keys are all defined properly and well. You cannot use overlays to define multiple key segments. So one area you might need to do a little bit of work is if you've got keys defined via overlays, you might need to rethink that in the repository and flip some of those things around. The issue is that when we're doing code generation, overlay fields are not visible. Okay? So that is one restriction that might require a little bit of work. Another thing is we very frequently ignore the key type and key segment type and segment order fields in the repository here, and it really helps the EF provider if you define that if this key segment is a decimal field, define it as a decimal key segment as well. It really helps things work a lot better. Also, key names are used when naming relationships. So you might have seen in some of the example slides already, when Jeff talked about $expand, it said, I think it was customer $expand equals rel_favorite item. Favorite item would have been the name of the key. In a lot of repositories, I've seen it, it's just key 0, key 1, key 2, key 3. So that's what you're going to get in the code-generated code for the names of those relations. So make sure that you use meaningful names when you're describing the keys as well. Relationships often go both ways. If you don't have a relationship in your repository already between one structure and another, and you find that it makes sense to put one in from here to there, it probably makes sense to put it in from here to here as well and go backwards in both directions. And that will help make sure you've got all the functionality you can. If you need to create that reverse relationship, but there is no logical key that lets you do that, then that's what foreign keys are for in the repository. I'm not going to go into much detail, but read up on it if you need to. Remember that relationships in the repository are one thing that can take time, because it's a complex thing. You've got to sit down and think about, from here, where in all my other files do I have relationships to define? And it can take some time to get into place. But that's where a lot of the huge benefits of OData really come from. If you have files with multiple record types, then that's what tags are for in the repository. A tag would typically be, this field is an A, means it's this type of record, or this field is a value of 0, means it's that kind of record. Make sure those things are in place if you have multi-record files. Just like with ODBC, in this environment, those will get exploded out into logical entities, if you like. So you might have one ISAM file that's got 3 different types of records in. You're going to get 3 different entity endpoints out of it. Just like with ODBC. So you deal with that in exactly the same way. There is no longer an example of that in our sample environment, but there was originally, and it's fully tested, and we know it fully works. So once you've got your repository in place, there's really 2 ways of getting up and running with Harmony Core development. One is the easy way. The easy way is to use our project templates. We have one primary project template in a NuGet package called harmony.core.project_templates. So you'll find that on nuget.org. You can install that on your machine using a command .NET new -i harmony.core.project_templates, and it will download that project template from NuGet and install it onto your machine. And you can then use .NET new Harmony Core to create a new Harmony Core project. There is also a second set of templates out there right now that I think is called harmony.core.conference 2018 or something like that. And that's a copy of the same thing with some additional stuff in it, purely to support the workshop on Friday. Once you've got the project template up and running, the next step is to probably open it up in Visual Studio and start thinking about getting your repository in place in that environment. You can do it the manual way if you wish. You can just create a .NET Core class library and start adding the required NuGet package references that we mentioned earlier and configuring things yourself, creating models folders and controllers folders and all that kind of stuff. If you really want to configure it all manually in Visual Studio, you can do so. If you do that, then you'll have to go off and get the CodeGen templates. When you do a .NET new Harmony Core, all of the CodeGen templates currently are included in that project template. Jeff mentioned we're looking at improving that mechanism as soon as we can. But if you do it manually, then you'll need to go off to GitHub and pull the latest copy of the templates. So getting started via project templates, you're going to do something like .NET new Harmony Core -n lets you name the project. If you don't specify a name, I think it's project 1 or something in the current directory. -o lets you name a subfolder, so then it will create a subfolder and create the new project in there. Just be aware that if you don't give it a -o option, it creates it in the current directory. So if you're expecting it to create a folder, you have to use -o. In that environment, you'll find there's some solution files. There's a code generation script and a user-defined tokens file. There's a repository project with an empty schema in our main project template. There is a services project where we code generate all of the main service code into, and there's a project called services.host, which contains a little console application that will build and run and host the sample services. The sample environment does include a little hard-coded sample service called books. So when you run it up, if you literally create a new project, open it in Visual Studio, or not in Visual Studio, you can build it and run it at the command line, and you can connect to the endpoint, and it will serve up information about a sample environment. There is some very, very simple book data. So it looks, the data you'll get back, and I'll show you how you do this later, but it has books and presses and a couple of books defined, each of which has a relationship to the press that published the book. Very, very simple stuff. You can browse the code is in there that generates the the entity data model and defines the data type, and there's some code in the constructor of the hosting program that just hard codes a couple of books in memory. So once you've got the project template up and running, the next thing you want to do is get your repository in there. You've got really three options. We provide a repository project with an empty repository schema called repository.scm. So the easiest way is just overwrite that schema file with your own repository. If you prefer, you can go into the properties of that repository project and check the use existing repository project and just point it at your existing repository files if you prefer to do that. Or you can just remove the repository references, get rid of the project, and set your own RPSM file and T-file environment variables, probably in common properties for the remaining projects. So however you decide to configure your repository, as long as it's visible in that environment. Once you've got the repository in there, you're ready to start generating stuff. And I know that a lot of you won't be familiar with CodeGen. You'll see a lot about how CodeGen's going to work and how it behaves in the video of Friday if you're not able to join us for that. There are two primary files that we provide. There is a user-defined tokens file, and rather than looking at it here, let's just go off and look at the actual thing. So this is the user-defined tokens file that we provide out of the box. And this is just some sort of default values that we use. So most of these things are injected into code at certain places. For example, you can see API title, Harmony Core sample title. It's the title for the documentation page. There are some URLs in here, there's contact names, there's what protocols we're using, what IP ports we want to operate on, things like that. So if you want to customize high-level stuff that's generated into the projects, this is one place that you can customize what gets code generated, okay? In addition to that, we provide a CodeGen environment that's really just defined by something as simple as a batch file right now. So we provide a batch file, it's called regen.bat, it sits in the top level directory, in the solution directory, and it's pre-configured to generate a basic environment. You just have to give it a couple of bits of information. By default, it's going to generate model, metadata, and controller classes, and the EF core stuff, so an EDM builder, EDM model, a DB context, and all the startup code to configure everything. And that batch file, I'll show you it in a moment, has a bunch of configurable options. I think there's 22 individual options that you can say, I want this, I don't want that, I want this, and so on. And you turn those options on and off. Some of those options cause additional things to get generated in terms of additional files. Some of them cause additional code to be generated or different code to be generated in certain files. And on Friday, like I say, we will step through that and help you understand exactly what every one of those options does and why you may or may not want to use it. So the batch file, one thing to note at the top of the batch file is the names of the services. You'll notice these correspond with, at least two of these correspond with the names of the projects in the default solution. So this is essentially going to determine where code is generated to, into the services folder and into the services.host folder. And if you enable unit test generation, then that code will be generated into the services.test folder, which isn't there in the default project. The one thing you really have to do to get up and running is tell it what structures you want to play with, okay? So towards the top of the batch file, and again, rather than talk about it there, let's just zip over to Visual Studio and show you. So this is the actual batch file. I've already configured it. The only thing I've changed in this batch file is I've listed the structures that I want to expose through my web service. So I'm exposing customers, items, orders, order items, and vendors, which are the 5 pieces of data in our sample repository. The only other change I made to this file is, and again, this is one area that some customization would be required, but in our environment, I think I mentioned yesterday that in this environment, a post operation creates a new entity, but the primary key for that entity is generated in the back end, okay? So we have a sample subsystem, and there is a mechanism that you can plug in your own code to say when a primary key is required for customer, where does it come from? And you can plug in custom code to go read the next available record number from a file or get it from wherever you get it in your environment. And in our sample environment, that's what this params str is. We have a relative file called sysparams that has next customer number, next order number, next item number, and all of those kind of things. So that's a little bit of a custom implementation for the sample environment and might need a little bit of work in the real environment. But other than that, we basically just list the structures, and you can see here, by default, all of these options are turned off. Okay? So if I generate code from this file with all of these turned off, I get basic endpoints that expose all customers, a customer, all vendors, a vendor, all orders, an order. That's all I get out of the default environment. And then we start on Friday, we're going to go through these things in turn and explain exactly what changes these things cause and why you may or may not want them. But this solution essentially represents the end of the workshop on Friday. Okay? So we configure our batch file and we start generating code. There's our optional 22 options. And we may well add more over time. You know, this is a fairly comprehensive set, but it may be that we extend this and give you all kinds of additional options, really looking for feedback on what this thing needs to do from this point on. So in the default environment that's generated, if all we do is name our structures and say generate code, and then we add those source files into our project and build it, by default, the environment we create exposes an HTTP endpoint and an HTTPS endpoint. By default, those port numbers that are used are controlled by two of those values in the user-defined tokens file, so you can override them there if you want to use different values. By default, we configure the startup code in Web API such that if anybody arrives at the HTTP endpoint, we immediately redirect them to the HTTPS endpoint. Okay? So everything's HTTPS. Because we're using HTTPS, you do have to have an SSL certificate. And very nicely, .NET Core now provides an SSL developer certificate or the ability to create one. So you can create yourself an SSL certificate using the .NET command .NET devcerts HTTPS. That creates a certificate and registers it on your machine. And if you say .NET devcerts HTTPS ---- trust, that adds a trust rule into your system on that system so that you can test with HTTPS locally on your development system. Clearly, in the real world, if you're going to expose an HTTPS service, you're going to have to go out and get a certificate from somewhere real that's going to be trusted by the clients that are going to be using you. So the default capabilities, if you do nothing other than name structures and then generate code, is you get that HTTPS endpoint, and if you go to the /odata URL after that endpoint, OData will serve up a list of entities that it knows about, and that's what we're seeing over here. Okay? It's saying to us, I know about customers, it's an entity set, so a collection of something, and it exists at this URL. So URL /odata/customers is where you will find that entity set. And it knows about items and orders. So any OData service, if you go to the base URL, it will serve up this list of entities. Okay? You also get a metadata endpoint, which is OData/metadata, and I'll show you these things in a little bit later, but that will serve up the OData metadata, which is actually an XML format, strangely enough, and there are lots of things out there that are able to understand and consume OData metadata. So there is tooling available to help you consume the service based on that metadata, for example. In fact, I think Dan told me earlier that one of the database query tools that reporting tools that he's been working with recently understands how to consume OData metadata and build BI reports off it and things like that. So that metadata URL serves up data that tooling can use. That's one of two ways you can do that. And as I mentioned already, you get an endpoint for all of the entities and you get an endpoint for an individual entity. And note that OData uses this parentheses structure for specifying keys. Okay, if you peek into the code that's generated, what you're basically going to see is a controller in the controllers folder for each of those entities that we're serving up, and you'll see dependency injection happening. So here's the constructor for customers controller, and you can see it's receiving an instance of DB context. So DB context is the EF provider, the runtime instance of the EF stuff, and we save that away in a local member, and that DB context is now available to any endpoint methods within the controller. That's what Jeff was talking about when he said dependency injection. Our constructor just says, I would like a DB context, please, and when somebody constructs one of these controllers, they hand it to us, and that gives us access to all of our underlying data. In the controllers, you will also find, as well as the constructor and the dependency injection, by default in the base environment, you'll find two methods. One, for example, here we've got get all customers, and it simply uses the DB context and returns the customers collection. This is a little helper method that also returns an HTTP OK, 200 OK. And that's it. That literally is all the code you need to expose the customer endpoint. Okay. You will also find a method for each of the entities that is basically accepts a primary key data through parameters. These attributes, by the way, are declaring the routes that are tagged onto the OData URL to get access to this endpoint. So if we go to OData customers paren, and actually customer number equals, or in fact you can just put the primary key value, if it's a single segment primary key at least. And you can see here again, we're just using the EF provider, dbcontext.customers.findQuery, and passing the primary key, and it returns the customer. Or it returns a not found, essentially. So that's what you'll find in the basic environment. And then we have options you can turn on, lots of them, 22 of them as we've seen. One of them allows you to generate API documentation for the thing. So in the batch file, you will see that there is a thing that's commented out. It says enable Swagger docs equals yes, or whatever it is. I can't remember exactly what it says. And if you simply remove the comment from that line in the batch file and regenerate code, it will generate a Swagger file. And you add that file to the project in a certain way. You'll see exactly the process on Friday, and that will cause API documentation to be generated for you. And as Jeff showed briefly earlier, and I will show briefly again, assuming I manage to get to the end of this session on time, the API documentation not only tells you what operations are available at what URLs, it also documents the data types that are going to come back and what properties or what types of data, and it gives you sample data. It also lets you go in there and say, I want to test out this operation and I want to get customer number 33, please, execute, and it actually runs that function against the web service, captures the data and presents it. Right now, we code generate the Swagger information, and it's kind of laborious to do it. But there's a thing out there called Swashbuckle that actually just parses the API when you build it and automatically generates that information. Right now, it works great with Web API, but doesn't work too well with OData. But we believe there's a new version of that coming as part of a different project that we're going to get into. So all of a sudden, the quality of the API documentation is pretty good right now. It's acceptable and it's usable, but it's going to go to a whole new level fairly soon, hopefully. Other things you can do. If you wish, there is an option that says enable alternate keys. And if you do that, we will generate one additional method into the controller for every alternate key that's found on every file. And it will have a route of something like OData customers paren state equals, based on the names of the key segments. By the way, you can see that the names of your fields in the repository and the names of your keys are quite important here. So if your fields are called, cuz001, cuz002, cuz003, that's what you're going to see in this environment. So, having well-named things in the repository makes this a much more pleasant experience. Okay. So if you turn on enable alternate keys, you get additional endpoints, one per alternate key. So now you can drill into customers by state or the account rep that owns them, or whatever is defined by a primary key. You can also turn on the enable count option, and if you do so, that enables you to go drill against an entity set, a collection, and add $count on the end, and instead of returning all customers or all customers in California, it just says there are 15 of them. So it gives you a count of how many entities. How many orders does customer 5 have? 37. Okay, so that may or may not be useful in your client applications. You can also enable property endpoints. One of the things about RESTful APIs is they're very, very efficient in terms of the nature of the data that they return. But if you're building a mobile app, there might be scenarios where, given a customer ID, you just want to know what the account name is, for example. That's all you need. You don't want to bring back the whole customer record, and you don't want to have to go to the overhead of filtering, dollar select equals whatever. So if you turn on enable property endpoints, it adds an endpoint for each and every property field in the record. So you can go customer 8 name, customer 8 phone number, customer 9 fax number, customer 15 account balance, and that's all you get back in the response. Okay? So that may or may not be useful depending on what your client applications are. Here's some code examples. So if we turn on alternate keys, here's just an example of what we get. We've got a get customer by state, and it has the parameter based on the segments of the key. There may be, if it's a multi-segment key, there'll be multiple parameters you have to provide, and that just exposes the data. And as you can see in the EF provider, there's an extension method called find alternate, which is finding result sets by alternate key, and it's named key value, key segment value, key segment value, key segment value if it's a multi-segment key. Individual name endpoints, nothing clever happening there. We just use the EF provider to find the individual entity that matches, and instead of returning the whole entity, we return result.name or result.phone or whatever it is. We just return the individual property. Another thing you can do is if you use enable select. So enable select, Jeff talked about select this morning. It's the ability on the URI to say, I want to return items $select equals item number, comma, quantity on hand. So select lets you narrow the result set for an entity to only individual property or properties. It's like a sparse, essentially under the hood, it's a sparse select in the underlying Synergy. Okay. You can also enable filter. If you turn that on, then you get to use the $filter and an expression. Or these expressions, it doesn't have to be as simple as a simple expression like this. Here I'm just saying filter equals credit limit greater than 5,000. But you can do ands and ors and greater than or equals, less than or equals, all of those typical operators, and you can build up complex expressions to filter the rows that are returned, the records that are returned, essentially. And obviously, filters under the hood are becoming where clauses in the underlying selects. You can also enable order by. It enables you to say, I want to order the results by unit price descending. And again, you can have multiple levels. Hopefully that's something that's going to translate into a key, but if not, then we'll sort the results and return them in the right sequence for you. Paging options while reading data. Another thing that the query mechanisms allow you to do in an OData service is if you say enable top in the code generation file, then it will enable you to restrict how many rows come back from a query. So you can say, give me items, $top equals 10. We'll just give you the first 10 items. Okay? So it's the beginning of allowing you to do paging. There is also an enable skip. So enable, top and skip are common concepts in the database world, right? So this allows you to say, skip the first 10 and then return another 10. So now you can get the first page, the second page, the third page, the fourth page, okay? Yes, it's not cheap to do that in ISAM right now because it is going to start at the top, read forward and find, so it gets more and more expensive the further you go. But as Roger mentioned the other day, we have a design in mind to mitigate that in a future version of Synergy. So top is fine. It just starts reading and then stops when it's got there. Beware of using skip too much at this point in time because it's not very efficient. Depends on what you're doing. If you know it's only a small set of records, then don't worry about it. But don't be doing it to page 5 at a time through 15,000 customers or something. It would not be very efficient to do that. The real powerful stuff is when you start drilling into relations. So if you say enable relations, what you wind up with is in the data models, as well as individual properties for the fields of that record, you will get a property that represents all of each relationship out to another entity. So for example here, I believe this is the relations in our sample data for customer. So we get a property called rel orders that represents the collection of orders of that customer, okay? And rel favorite item in our data, every customer is able to identify an inventory item and say that's my favorite. It's the old report writer plant data, right? Or a version of it. So you can see here, collection of order. So some of them might drill down in a one-to-many, and the bottom one there, the favorite item, clearly is a one-to-one relationship out to a single item. And you can drill through those things using the $expand syntax in the OData URL. So you can say things like customers, $expand equals rel orders, says give me customers and their orders, okay? Or customer 8 $expand rel order says give me customer 8 and their favorite inventory item. If the related items that you pull back from one $expand have other relations, then you can drill into those relations and those relations and those relations. You can drill all the way through. So here's this is one URL, okay, and this is actually a simple one. All it's got is expand and select. There could be filters and order bys and stuff in here as well, but it just blew my mind trying to represent it on a slide. So here we're saying, give me customer 8. From customer, all I want to see is the customer number and the name. I would also like to see their orders. From the order file, I just want to see the order number and what the date of order was. I also want to see the items that were ordered for each order, and I want to see the item number, date ordered, quantity ordered, unit price. I also want to drill down from the order item to the actual inventory item that that line item represents, and I want to see the common name and the size, and then I want to drill into the vendor that provided that item and see the vendor name. Okay, that's one URL, but that will drill through all 5 files, doing 4 joins and returning selected data at each level. And as I say, I could be doing filter and order by as well in some cases if I wanted to. And bear in mind, all I'm doing is hitting the order endpoint. Okay, this is just a client-side URL that determines all this stuff. My web service just has a thing called customer 8. Okay, and I query on it. That's the real power of OData. So there's the result. As you can see, the JSON data set that we're getting back has, here's the 2 fields from the customer I requested. Here's the related orders or the first order. Here's the items on the first order or the first item. Here's the inventory. Oh, okay, my slides are out of date. I'm sorry, I didn't include the vendor in this one. I think I tagged the vendor onto the file. I'll show you this example running later. But it's extremely powerful. Beyond CRUD, we've got create, update, delete, and so on. Again, just to go through the various operations, because they're a little bit different to what I talked to you about last year when we just talked about raw web API. We've taken things a little bit further. Last year, I said to you, post is a create, okay? And a lot of places you'll go will tell you that. If you really get into the nitty-gritty of REST and OData, a post is a create of a new entity where the entity ID, the primary key, is going to be automatically generated. Okay, so that's what post represents in this world, and it will require that you provide that plugin code under our hood that says if I need a primary key for customer, I'm going to call you and you're going to give me a primary key value, right? Or I'm going to pass you the entity and you're going to fill in the primary key for me. So that's what a post does. A put in this world is essentially you're putting an entity, you're replacing it. Okay, you're saying, I've got this entity, I'm going to replace it on the server. So it's a full update of the entire entity. All of the properties are going to get replaced. However, if you do a put and the entity does not exist in this world, then it will be created. Okay, and in that case, you are expected that it is expected that the client is providing the primary key. Patch, as I already mentioned, is a partial update, very efficient. It lets you say, given an existing entity, change this property to this value or this property to that value. It's a really targeted property by property update, and deletes the entity. How we do that is we have individual operations in our code generation batch file that says enable post. Okay, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but when you post to the collection, because you don't know what the primary key is. So you don't post items 57 being the new item. You just say, I'm creating a new item in entity in items, and go off and pick the primary key. You put to a specific entity, because you're updating a specific entity, or you're specifying if it is created, then this is going to be the primary key. You post to the collection, you put because you're updating to a specific entity. That's what I was talking about there. If you're doing a patch, again, you're going to send a patch document, and I'll show you what that means and what it looks like in a moment, to a specific entity, the item with the primary key 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we include the data in the body of the request. And delete, again, we do a delete operation to a specific entity to delete that entity. Okay. Here's what a patch document looks like. So if you're doing a post or a put, you're just sending the JSON for the entity, with all the property names and values and so on. A patch says we're going to replace the value of the contact property with this value and replace the credit limit with this value. And that's the only 2 things that are going to change in that entity. Okay? Again, Jeff mentioned earlier that we support the ASP.NET identity environment. I'm not going to take time to go into that and how the JSON web tokens and stuff work. If you're with us on Friday, we will go into some more detail. I'm not going to demonstrate authentication in use today, but right at the end of the exercises on Friday, we will turn on authentication and we will talk to an OAuth 2 server and we'll obtain a token and prove that we have to provide that token into the service to access operations, and we'll show that how the type of token we have, whether it has certain roles or certain claims, will determine what data we can and can't see in the result set. So we'll go through all of that stuff on Friday. All I'm going to say right now is we just turn on enable authentication. If you do that, then we add an authorized attribute to every controller. So essentially, by default, if you just turn on authentication, everybody has to be authorized. So you've logged in as a known user. There's no permissions as such in the default environment. It's just you have to be authenticated in order to access the service at that point. We do also have a mechanism to enable authorization based on individual roles. I'll show you how that works in a moment. There are also some options. If you turn on enable authentication in the user-defined tokens file, you can specify roles that are required for get, post, put, patch, and delete operations. So you can do a higher level of restriction saying every authenticated user gets read access, but to delete anything you have to have this certain role or whatever. This is an area we probably need to do some more work in. You know, we've got fairly good coverage for either just general authentication or operation-based authentication based on roles, and we've got protection of fields at the role level. But there's probably other schemes that we need to take care of in the CodeGen templates. And again, we're very much looking for feedback in that area. There's also an enable field security option that you can turn on. And if you do that, then we start looking for the Harmony Authenticate tag in the long description that I talked about earlier. So field by field in the repository, you can specify this field requires authentication, in which case we will add an authorized field attribute and simply restrict access to the field so it's not visible to unauthenticated users. Or you can add a Harmony roles and name one or more roles that are required in order to see that field. Okay? And again, this is an area we may need to do a little bit of extra work, really looking for feedback on what's needed. So that's what you can generate out of the box, all of that functionality just based on a repository structure with keys and relations. Okay? Pretty powerful in its own right. But as Jeff mentioned earlier, we also have the ability for you to customize things and add custom functionality. All of our controllers are implemented as partial class. So you can simply create a second, third, fourth part of that partial class and start adding your own methods and your own operations and extend the controllers to do whatever you want them to do. So you might choose to add either Web API or OData endpoints through additional partial classes. And also the other mechanism we have is the Sprock mechanism that Jeff mentioned earlier. What that allows you to do, if you didn't kind of cotton on to what that does, it simply allows you to pretty much take any class with any old method and just attribute the class as controller, okay? And it becomes, the class doesn't have to extend Web API controller or OData controller. You just add the controller attribute to any old class, and we will expose public methods that are in that class. So it's one way of exposing possibly existing code, although this is .NET in process code that we're talking about here. And then remember, there's the other mechanism to use SSH to go out to traditional Synergy, which I'm not going to particularly talk about in this presentation. Another thing you can do is we have an option that says enable Postman tests. If you've ever worked in the Web API environment, you'll probably already know that there's a utility out there called Postman, which is a very popular application that lets you construct HTTP requests. Anything that's a simple GET request, you can just do in a browser. You just paste the URL into a browser and it'll return the data. But if you want to be able to test post operations and puts and deletes and patches and things like that, you can't construct that in a browser without writing software. So what Postman lets you do is construct and say, I want to do a post to this URL with these HTTP headers, and I want to send this JSON data, and it does that and shows you the response. So if you turn on enable Postman tests, we will generate a little JSON file that has Postman test definitions for all of the endpoints that are included in the controllers, so that you can use Postman to test the API as well. So that's an alternate mechanism to testing through the Swagger documentation. And I'll show you that in a moment. And finally, you can also enable unit test generation. This is probably an area we need to do a little bit more work in, but we do generate basic unit tests that just execute or exercise each of the operations in the controllers that we generate, and you can execute. Unfortunately, Visual Studio right now doesn't support running .NET Core unit tests through the UI in the Test Explorer in Visual Studio, so you run these tests at the command line by saying .NET test, and it runs the unit test project and reports on the results to you. And again, I'll show you a lot more about that on Friday. So I'm going to very quickly show you a little demonstration. I have running on my system right here an instance of a Harmony Core service. Essentially what I'm running is almost the end stage of the workshop from Friday. The only part I don't have running right now is the authentication, because that takes a little bit more demonstrating, because you have to go off and get access tokens and all of that kind of stuff. So we'll leave that till Friday. So I have a service running on my IIS instance, and I also have the exact same service as Jeff mentioned this morning running on an Azure web instance. The URL is there, harmonycoreapp.azurewebsites.net. If you want to hit it with a browser and play with it yourself, please do. Let us know how it goes. So I'll show you a couple of things just in the browser, and I'll show you a couple of things in Postman, just to give you the feel of what's going on. So this is what our homepage looks like for our demonstration instance. Our project template doesn't actually include this right now. It has a really basic homepage. So this one right now has been handcrafted. I do intend to add code generation of something like this into the standard package so that you'll get a little service homepage as well. Although you might argue that the API documentation is actually the service homepage as well. So here's the little homepage we're talking about. Let's show you that. Let's go down this thing in order. Exposed entities. So there's our base address / OData. That's just the OData service telling us about the entities that it knows about. Okay. We have the OData metadata. So this is every OData service has /$ metadata, and this is the XML metadata for the service. This is the thing that, like I said earlier, there is tooling out there that will consume this. So you can point third-party tools at this URL, and it will consume this data and do various things for you. I'm not going to say more than that because I haven't actually used any of them myself. Here's the API documentation. It's by default at the base address / API docs. Again, that URL is configurable through the user-defined token file if you want it to be called something else. Or you don't have to have it. Just don't turn on Swagger docs and you don't get this. Here's all the operations for customer, item, order item, vendor. You also get documentation for the various data types with data types and field, property names, data types, sample data, and so on. As I mentioned earlier, you can exercise the service through here. So we could go into here's get by. Well, let's do a get by state. Here's get customers by state. I can say I want to try it out. And because I've got querying turned on, look, I could say state is California, and I can put expand rules and select rules and order bys and so on straight into this UI. Or if I just execute the query, then it comes back and says, yep, there's your customers in California. Okay, so that's one way of interacting through Postman. Also, these examples, I'm going to be expanding these examples, but remember, the only thing you have to use Postman to test is post, put, delete, patch. If it's just the get stuff and the query stuff, which is the really exciting stuff, you can just test it through a browser. So all of these things, if I hit all customers, it just goes to OData customers, and there's all of our customer data. Okay, so you can just test most of this stuff in a browser. Let me show you the one I talked about earlier. This is that query that goes down through five ISAM files. So it starts off with customer 8, all their orders, the items, the inventory, and the vendor. If we fire that one off, and bear in mind, I'm going against the Azure site right now. If I do this locally, how fast is this? That done, okay, and that's out in the cloud. Here's customer 8, here's their first order, there's the first item on that order, there's the item ordered, there's the vendor of that item, second order, third order, and so on. So please hit this URL, play around with this stuff. The way you start to really appreciate what this stuff does is just hover over this thing or just click on them and look at what's happening in the URL. Okay, so here we've said I want all items and I want to see orders for that item. So here's an item, there's an order for that item. Here's another item, there's an order for that item. Some items presumably have more than one order. Our sample data, there's 2 orders for that item. Our sample data is pretty minimal. So, first question is, have you done any testing with large numbers of structures and files, i.e. 1,000 plus structures?
So the answer to that is no, we have not tried thousands of structures, although that number is very large. So having a RESTful web API that uses thousands of different entities would be abnormal. I would definitely say that'd be abnormal. That's probably more entities than in the entirety of the Microsoft Graph, which is an extremely large surface area. So I'd be curious why you might want thousands of entities in your RESTful web service. So I don't really anticipate there's any problem with 1,000 structures. Your metadata file will be very large because it will include all 1,000 structures. The startup might be a little bit slower because it has to actually generate all of that metadata. But other than that, it should work.
Jeff mentioned briefly yesterday, we're looking at ways of not stopping CodeGen being a command line option, but adding the option of running CodeGen as a tool directly inside Visual Studio in MS Build in a project. So you wouldn't even see CodeGen as a thing at that point, it would just happen in the background.
And there wouldn't be a command line, so there wouldn't be a command line length limitation, because it would just be running the code directly in the MS Build task.
Okay. The other thing is related to this, we are very aware that our test data is small at this point in time. We have 5 files and we have, at maximum like 40, 50 records in the files. I did start a project of writing a data generator for the environment to generate, hundreds or thousands of customers and tens of thousands of orders and things like that, but we just ran out of time before the conference. So that is on my list of things to do in the very near future. Not anticipating it producing any problems. We have run it, I've run it against a couple of other ISAM files that have 40, 50,000 items in there and didn't run into any issues at all, but we certainly will be extending the size of the sample data and validating with much larger data sets pretty soon. Anonymous, can you explain the difference again between patch and put? Why wouldn't I always put? Performance is probably the main item there with both a put, well, assuming you're doing put for an update, because put is also used to create if you are specifying the primary key as the client, as the consumer. But assuming you're updating something, a put operation essentially replaces every property in an entity. So you're rewriting every property, you're passing every property over the network and updating every property in the entity in the file. Whereas with a patch operation, you're simply sending a change instruction, which is a significantly smaller piece of data over the wire from the consumer to the server. And that's the primary advantage. Clearly, it's still an ISAM record. Clearly, under the hood, we're still reading the record and writing the record. It's really about what goes over the wire and the flexibility of only changing one property.
Patch is also potentially a lot more friendly to concurrent writers of a record. So if your patch instructions say, I just want to increment whatever values in this field, then it doesn't really matter if that record has changed out from under you, as long as all the validation still passes after the increment has occurred, then the operation is going to be successful. So less data, less concurrency conflicts. I guess that's the main advantage of patch.
Right. The next question is there documentation / wikis available? Yes, there is. Somewhat limited right now. That is very much a to-do for right after the conference. We're using the wiki on GitHub. There are already some sort of brief introductory things there. There's some information about the various modes that we have available to protect code. There's some information about the requirements and how to get up and running. One of the things I will be doing is the workshop, I'm going to be guiding you through every little step. I do have most of it already documented, and we will be extending the wiki next week with a step-by-step, explaining every stage of building an environment as we do in the workshop. But again, the documentation point is the wiki on the GitHub repository. Another question, if you enable field authentication and the user has no role that allows them to see any field, does it return a fail or success with no fields?
That kind of shouldn't happen unless we're talking about using select to pick which fields you're looking at. So It would be very strange to fully restrict all of the fields individually of a
Right.
structure against someone rather than restricting access to the endpoint that produces that
Right.
structure.
But if it did happen, I think they just get omitted on a property by property basis.
They do get emitted on a property by property basis, but if you actually asked for the field with select, you would get back a 401,
yeah, unauthorized.
403 or whatever it is.
Right. But if you're just selecting the whole entity and everything has
entity is
been
just
removed
empty.
from you, you'll get an empty entity. When unit tests were mentioned earlier, was this a reference to the Postman tests? No, it was not. They are two separate things. So you have the option to generate a JSON file which contains Postman import stuff that gives you tests in Postman. If you generate unit tests, we actually generate unit test classes with unit test methods and use the .NET test framework to build and execute those tests. So we build classes attributed as whatever they are, test, and the methods that are attributed as test, and it's real full-blown unit tests. And they are, I believe they are partial classes as well, so you can extend them with custom tests if you wish. If not, they're about to be. Does the API documentation display the relations, files, and foreign keys?
It's supposed to show navigations, but currently we were not seeing that when we were looking at it yesterday. And the Swagger docs do show all of the endpoints, but I don't think they actually show the relations. They do show the keys because we have all the alternate keys documented as endpoints.
So I think in the Swagger documentation, at the top is all the operations, and at the bottom is all the documentation of the data types and all the properties. And I believe the rel underscore extension navigation properties show up in that list of properties. And again, if they don't right now, they will very soon. Since everything is JSON, is there a JSON API? There are lots of good JSON APIs in lots of various languages. If you're in the .NET world, then JSON.NET is by far the default that everybody uses. If you're talking about traditional Synergy and OpenVMS, Mr. Blundell, then yes, there is. There is a JSON parser that Jeff wrote. Actually, somebody asked this question at the last conference, and I believe you wrote it on the aircraft on the way home from the conference, right?
Yes, that is a representation.
So, and I believe that one is in Jeff's personal GitHub repo.
Yeah, we can fork that onto Synergex.
Right. Is there a limit to the depth or number of levels that you can drill down? I'm not aware. There is a depth. There's an artificial depth that you can apply. I believe if you look in the user-defined tokens file, that's one of the pieces of information that you can specify through that mechanism. I believe we default to 5 levels because we have 5 levels in our sample data, but there is a mechanism that you can restrict artificially the absolute maximum depth that you can drill down with expand. When you post, can you pass an alternate key instead of the primary key? If you post, you do not provide primary keys. Typically, you would have to provide alternate keys because alternate keys tend to be, by definition, required values in most cases. So yes, if you post to create a new entity without primary key, typically you provide values for all of the required properties except the primary key.
Just to quick clarify, the URL, I'm assuming that question is the URL that you post to, could you have it include the alternate keys?
Oh.
But there's no reason to include the alternate keys because the data you're posting includes the alternate keys. You just want to post at a post endpoint,
URL.
and it gets sorted out under the hood.
URL doesn't involve a key on a post.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
You post to the collection, right.
So you shouldn't need that behavior.
What I was mainly looking for was that if you put in an alternate key value, will the Harmony Core interpret it as a primary key value if it does not exist?
You will get if you post and include a key value in the URL, I believe you will get a 404 not found because it's not a valid URL for a post. When creating a new record via a post, can we call custom code to allocate the primary key? Yes. I think I mentioned that briefly yesterday, and we'll be going through it in more detail in the workshop, but there is an interface that you can implement to provide custom code that the framework will call into to obtain primary key values for whenever a post takes place. And if you do not provide that extension point, I guess you can't do a post. You have to have a mechanism implemented to provide primary keys in order to post.
Well, they can still write their own post. They just can't use our
Right,
code-generated
just can't use
post.
our code-generated post, right. Yes, you could override it and add your own that just takes primary key from the data, I guess. And do you want to talk about the extra stuff you were talking about?
Yeah, so on the topic of the primary key generator, I am planning on slightly modifying the interface in the very near future to minimize the length of time that locks are taken as part of that primary key generation process, because those also have to be transactional in nature, and we don't want to write anything to disk if your transaction has failed, because no one likes giant gaps in their ID sets for primary keys.
Right. And the final question is, are the Harmony Core APIs ready to be used? If so, where can I download them? I would say yes, they're ready to be used. I would say let's consider them beta at this point in time, but I think we are very much looking for other people to get involved and give us that feedback. We are aware of one or two fairly minor things that are not implemented and or not working right now, and they are documented on GitHub in the form of issues. So please feel free to review that. One of them, for example, I mentioned yesterday, there's a feature that allows you to say this decimal field that has a format string, for example, a phone number perhaps, I would like to expose it out through the API as the formatted string value, not the numeric value. And in that scenario right now, if you try and create or update, we do not destruct that back into a numeric value from the formatted value. So there's a couple of little areas like that that we know we need to clean up on. But beyond that, I believe, and I think Jeff would agree, it's in pretty good shape and usable.
And the place you get it from is NuGet.org.
Right.
If you go to add references using the NuGet package manager in any kind of .NET project, you can find it by typing Harmony Core, and you will see all of the packages that we've uploaded.
Yeah, the easiest way to do it, again, I showed you briefly yesterday, but if you're in the workshop tomorrow, you will see on NuGet also, as well as the 4 binary packages for the software, there are 2 packages for the project templates. So there's a harmony.core.project templates NuGet package. If you install that with .NET new minus I or minus I? I forget.
I think it's .NET New minus
.NET New minus I harmony.core.project templates, and then you can do a .NET New Harmony Core to create a basic set of projects and solutions and working, a sample environment. Again, you'll see that's in my slides from yesterday, and you will see it in much more detail tomorrow in the workshop.